This is John Kaiser at the Metals Investor Forum in Vancouver, September 15th, 2017. I am with Kerry Curtis of InZinc Mining. Kerry, welcome.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Kerry, I enjoyed your presentation earlier today. One question I have, this West Desert system has been around for many decades. And today in your presentation, you focused on a couple holes drilled to the east of the system on which millions and millions of dollars have been spent. And you're saying this is some really interesting unexplored potential. Why is this only being looked at today rather than decades ago when this one exciting hole you mentioned that was drilled in 1980?
Right. Well, John, I think in our business, sometimes we have a tendency to focus on reaching economic thresholds as quickly as we can with our deposits. And I think we see a pattern of that over a long period of time at West Desert, where they're very focused on expanding the zinc resource. Each program is directed at that and that alone. And sometimes we forget to have a look at the forest through the trees and take a look at the data that was generated, in this case in the 1980s, by Utah Mines, which produced a very well mineralized hole 650 meters away from the deposit. To me, that's fascinating because it tells me there's a vector out there. There's more mineralization. Don't ignore it. We need to take care of that. We need to tackle it because this system is persisting and persisting for quite some distance beyond what we know. And that's, for shareholders, I think that's the best you could do as a CEO, is to find new things, add them to the value of the company, and thereby increase the value of the company. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, John. Yeah.
Now this project is located in Utah, 150 kilometers or so from Salt Lake City, not far from one of the biggest world-class mines, Bingham Canyon. There's another project which I recommended last year, Arizona Mining's Hermosa Taylor, which has been a phenomenal success, attracted $100 million of financing from South 32. That project had $40 million spent on the Hermosa Central deposit, a near-surface zinc manganese oxide deposit, and the result of the feasibility study said, well, we really can't develop this. And yet the geologists went in there and started looking at the base of the deposit and started drilling holes, and lo and behold, the Hermosa Central is the tip of a giant iceberg. What similarities and differences in terms of location and geological potential do you see between West Desert in Utah and Hermosa Taylor in Arizona?
Right. Well, obviously the difference in location is obvious. One is in Arizona and one is in Utah. Personally, I tend to think that Utah is a better place to develop a mine. That's my personal view. And as you mentioned, having that large, long-lived Bingham Canyon world-class mine in that part of the state, you do realize it's a huge driver of the economy, that one mine, singularly. As far as similarities and differences, both have a lot of similarities in that the mineralizing systems are generated by hot, intrusive rocks, which produce fluids that follow structures through carbonate rocks, limestones. So they're very similar in that respect. Both deposits have oxides and sulfides. And in fact, the recognition of sulfides at Taylor Hermosa, I think, was a huge part of the exploration story there. They had an outbound hole about 1 kilometer away that was deep. It had a small, in that case, I think it was 3 feet of sulfide mineralization in it. And from what I can see, the exploration strategy was to follow that vector downtrend, and that resulted in the world-class deposit that they've outlined. West Desert is quite similar, John. We see similar trends. The drill hole we've been talking about today, the historical drill hole, which is 650 meters away from the deposit, tells us that exact same thing could happen. But we have no information. We have to drill. So there's a lot of similarities, some subtle differences. But if you compare West Desert to some other Western U.S. CRD porphyry-style models, another one is actually called Magma, which is now not in production. but it was one of the highest grade copper mines ever produced in Arizona. It started with a vein and moved down into manto-style massive sulfides, which produced all the copper. So we see a lot of similarities in how these deposits evolve. And as explorers, we have a lot of data and records that we know from good successful periods of time in the exploration of these things. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Now, Hermosa Taylor does not have any significant copper, but the West Desert does have significant copper associated with it. The deposit itself is a skarn deposit. A lot of metal ended up in one place. My understanding is that it takes a very, very substantial hydrothermal system to harvest and concentrate so much metal, and that there must be something very, very much bigger, perhaps more central, that the West Desert skarn deposit is itself peripheral, and yet it's going to be deep. There has always been an aversion to very deep deposits. What is the attitude now in the mining industry about looking for really deep, sort of almost Oyu Tolgoi type deposits,
right,
which can never be open pit mined and
right,
do need these extraordinary grades? What do you think is the industry's attitude these days?
Yeah, no, I think there's a recognition that we have to go deeper. We've been very successful in our industry in the past 30 or 40 years finding near surface deposits and open pit deposits. But I think the low-hanging fruit is gone, John. And maybe another example of all of this is I think the company's called Reservoir Capital, where they drilled underneath, found some fantastic grades underneath a low-grade copper deposit. And that's totally changed the company. Those are the kind of moves that I think we have to start taking. With improved geophysical techniques, I think we're reducing some of the risk associated with those deeper drill holes. But if I step back and look at my own career in this business over time, 30 years, when I started, we basically did base metal exploration, John. We weren't into gold exploration. Gold was, it was a small part of the industry. But in that period of time, we did 800 to 1 kilometer long drill holes, and it was quite common. We kind of shied away from that in the last 20 years. And part of that is because base metal exploration hasn't been as required, I guess. So maybe also we have to step back, and I think you alluded to this today, step back to the 1980s and take a look at that period of time and what was successful and what people were doing, and take that attitude, that exploration attitude forward.
And one last question. A decade ago, you were CEO of a company Cumberland bought out for $900 million. Another director, Wayne Hubert, was CEO of another company bought out for $4.6 billion or some extraordinary number like that. A decade later, both of you are looking at this company. What do you feel about what you're going to be able to do with this story that's, in terms of valuation, is extraordinarily cheap?
Right. Well, I think I was trying to outline the plan in our presentation today. The first step that we all see for West Desert in particular is another round of exploration. Not super costly, wide space drilling to ensure we know what's out there before we commence that de-risking process of taking a deposit through the pre-feasibility and feasibility stage and into the permitting stage. So we need to grow the company. That's very obvious, John, in order to do that. But the first step is exploration. And I made a reference to an old adage this morning. I think it's always wise to survey your lot before you build your house, especially if you are in our situation where you know there's mineralization out there, and significant mineralization, half a kilometer away from your deposit.
Yes, and as your slide pointed out, what you have, West Desert, as defined by the PEA, is in the money and worth developing at the zinc price that we have today. Exactly.
But one more step, making sure we know what we have to carry into the next stage, which gets more serious, more capital intensive. Those steps are, of course, pre-feasibility to feasibility level analysis. With the knowledge, we're not missing anything. That's huge. It gives management confidence to move the project forward.
Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you, John.
This has been Kerry Curtis and John Kaiser at the Metals Investors Forum in Vancouver.